Taking your seat, we've got a schedule to keep that follows this one at 2 o'clock sharp. So this one's going to be fun, I hope. These are two longtime advisors to Faith Angle who have been on a lot of forums and have a lot of stories about Mike Cromartie and have a lot of stories about their friends and peers in the industry. This is Carl Cannon and Will Salatan, and let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll hear from them each for 5 or 6 minutes, just a little bit, and then have a short conversation and turn it over to you. Okay, Carl Cannon, first of all, is the executive editor of Real Clear Politics here in DC, and the DC bureau chief as well. He's just very respected by a lot of peers, by a lot of people who've worked for him over the years. He led the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2003, chaired that, and takes a group every year. He was born in California, went to the University of Colorado, worked at the San Diego Tribune, and later the San Jose Mercury News, the Baltimore Sun, the National Journal. He won, with a team of people, a 1990 Pulitzer for coverage of the Loma Prieta earthquake. He's been a Harvard IOP Fellow. He won the 2006 Beckman Award, and he's covered every presidential convention since '84. So just been steady for a long time in the same direction. He wrote a book on happiness in 2003, and another one with his dad, who's the biographer of Ronald Reagan, Lou Cannon. Will Salatan has been, well, first of all, a 25-year writer at Slate. 25 years. I looked it up yesterday morning, how many articles that are live, and the live number of articles, I believe, is 2,937. Incredible, just bevy of pieces. He wrote a book in 2004 called Bearing Right, How Conservatives Won the Abortion War. He's written extensively on science and technology and politics and gay marriage and the Iraq War and abortion and more. And he is a writer today, just this last year, at The Bulwark. He's on Charlie Sykes' podcast very regularly, like he was this morning. One called Beg to Differ with Mona Charen frequently as well. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College, just very clear thinker, speaks and thinks in paragraphs, and it's just a joy to learn from and listen to. I'm not sure if it's prolific or prodigious or maybe a little bit of both, but it's wonderful to have you both here. We've asked Carl, I don't know, politics these days is complicated, but Carl maybe leads a little bit more to the right, Will leads a little bit more to the left. So we're gonna have, I think, maybe Carl speak first, Will speak second, a little bit, and then we'll have a brief chat and turn it over to you. Okay, Carl Cannon, welcome to Faith Angle.
At the risk of not being invited back, I do not lean right. Some of my best friends think this. I'm respectful to conservatives, but I myself am an old-fashioned reporter. Both my parents were Democrats. I'm not a conservative. Like I say, though, I think we ought to be able to write about conservatives without getting the vapors. And I do that pretty well, I think. So much so I fool even my good friends. I think it was 1952, a theologian named Helen Kenyon. It's a quote you're going to be familiar with. It's the earliest I've been able to track it. It said that 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. She was talking, of course, about black and white churches. Variations of this quote were repeated by others. Martin Luther King said it often. Malcolm X said it, and with an edge. Malcolm X had a flair for rhetoric, and he said high noon was the most segregated hour. That's so people are leaving churches. About 3 in 10 Americans answer none when given a list of their faith choices. You probably discussed this already. You will in the hours to come. This is higher, significantly higher than when Will and I started coming to the Faith Angle Forum. People of faith kind of rationalize themselves. That's not that bad. They say millions of Americans are spiritual. They're seekers. They just don't go to a church. And they say Abraham Lincoln didn't go to church, and he was obviously a man of deep faith. But the trend is true, and it's real. And now another way to look at it, the Washington Post had a story a couple of years ago. About 4 in 10 Americans describe themselves as secular. Now, they don't all use that word, but if you give them a choice, well, that's higher than it's ever been in American history, and it skews young. So there's an issue. And even before this trend began, big city newsrooms have been this way, sort of for decades. You could say that the most secular hour, not segregated, most secular hour in America is an hour before deadline in every big city newsroom. It has been for years. And all the impetuses in journalism, you know this, you're in our business, are accelerating that trend. There's no deadlines anymore. So if you follow my somewhat whimsical metaphor, we're secular all the time, not just the hour before deadline. The profession's getting younger. This is my way of thinking a good thing, but some of the pressures that are making it younger aren't good. They're economic, but younger people are less religious than their parents. So now I was born and raised in our profession. My father was a journalist. He's writing his memoirs. He's 89. He's finished them. 250,000 words. I don't think anybody's going to publish it. I tried to tell him gently, but he's still my dad. I'm the son, so we sent it to his agent. But he and I talked about this over for many years, and other people that I know and respect. So we're much more secular as a profession than the people we purport to cover. So is that a problem? I mean, taken to extreme, we are biblically illiterate in newsrooms. Some of us are openly hostile to religion. Is this a problem when we're trying to connect with readers and viewers? Well, I think it's obvious that it's a problem. So that was the structural problem that exists before Christianity in this country became politicized, and before Islam became politicized. Now, a word for my secular brothers and sisters in the Fourth Estate. This wasn't all their fault. The Moral Majority was formed in 1979 as an overtly political organization, and there are other groups that followed them. Jerry Falwell, who started it, did what many Southern Baptists and other conservative evangelicals, and when I say conservative, I mean theologically conservative people, did in this country, which is, before that time, they had taken what you heard in the Baptist church and other places is the Jesus line, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's. This was a shorthand for an explanation that politics is dirty. We don't have to be in that profession. This began changing over a series of issues. Abortion, and Will can tell you more about this, was one of the big catalysts. It made a young Democrat named Mike Gerson, who'd worked for Jimmy Carter, 4 years later worked for Ronald Reagan. So that's the period this is happening. The Roe decision accelerated it. The two parties split on this issue. It became a litmus test issue. It was never that before Roe. In Sacramento, where I lived, where Ronald Reagan was governor, he signed a liberalizing abortion law. In the legislature, Catholic Democrats were opposed to the law liberalizing abortion, and Republicans, Western Republicans, not Jerry Falwell types, more economic Republicans, they were in favor of it. But it was all across the board. This became an issue, and in fairness to these people like Falwell who helped politicize Christianity in this country, their view is that they didn't start the culture wars. Their view would be that they finally engaged, and that their values and their beliefs had been under assault for a long time by the media, and not just the media, by mainline Protestant churches, by liberal Catholics, by secular Jews, and by us, by the press, and that they were fighting back. So, in my career, I would see examples of this. This is a lack of sophistication for issues that it wasn't as important before the 70s and the 80s to be conversant on these issues if you're a political writer. Religion didn't exist the way it does now as a cutting edge issue. I use abortion as an example, but across the board, you couldn't tell how people voted by where they went to church. So once this began changing, though, it presented a challenge to us in the press. I was in the San Jose Mercury newsroom, sitting room one day, and a guy who was perfectly good political writer, he was Jewish, secular, had this idea, we need to do something on Billy Graham. I said, why? He said, he's selling out San Jose Municipal Stadium. This guy, he's a racist, he's a nut. They call these things crusades. And the city editor, God bless him, said, yeah, we should, Phil. That's a great idea. Carl, do a series on Billy Graham. He didn't let Phil go near it. But it turns out, so I grew up in California. I didn't know a lot about Billy Graham. There were at that time 5 or 6 major biographies of him. I read every one. Those days when newspapers made the kind of money that you young people will never see. They gave me a month, and I read every book about Graham. I flew to Charlotte, where he grew up. I checked the files and the way he had to go through a machine to look at the files of the Charlotte Observer. I went up to Rochester, Minnesota, where he lived. I interviewed him, and I produced a series about him, and I found out a lot of very interesting things about him. One is he wasn't an Elmer Gantry type about money. He grew up in North Carolina. He'd moved to Minnesota because it was the state. I'm going on too long, right?
Great.
It was the state that had the strongest consumer laws, and this was prompted by when Graham didn't have a church. He was a traveling preacher. These tent crusades. It goes back to Billy Sunday. Before it goes back to the founding of this country, and the last day of the crusade there would be an offering, and it would be the minister's offering. It would be to keep the show going and pay the people and everybody from the ushers to the pastor. And there was a crusade in Los Angeles that went on for weeks, and it sold out. This is in the 40s. And one of the pictures, the Hearst papers loved Graham. So the famous dictum went out from William Randolph Hearst, pump Graham. So he's on page 1 of the Herald Examiner, then the Examiner. One of the rival papers decided, well, they're going to do the opposite of pump Graham. And they get this picture of these guys counting the money on the last day. Put that on page 1. These Southerners dipping all the money. And Graham saw that and said, well, this won't do. And he moved his whole ministry to Minnesota so that every dollar would be reported. And and also on race, it turns out he and Martin Luther King, I found this out, I had an alliance, and they would do things together, and they would give each other, like, you do this and I'll do this, to integrate the churches, to make the 11 o'clock hour not the most segregated hour. And Billy Graham's crusades, one of the drawing points where they were not segregated, and African American Christians came and white Christians came, and this led to Graham being hung in effigy in South Carolina, and a governor denouncing him, a Trump-style racist governor denouncing him. And Graham, who used to come up here and play golf with Eisenhower, called the White House. And I think probably Sherman Adams said, we can get you a place. And they held the crusade. South Carolina wouldn't let him use any public venue, the state. And they did it in an army base. And Graham held this wild, integrated crusade. Anyway, this is the kind of coverage that it began to be a challenge to produce, especially as evangelical Christians became a partisan thing. You're with this sect, yeah, Episcopalian's great, this mega church over there not so great. And this was the sort of attitude that took root. Mike Gerson and I, he later became Bush's chief speechwriter, and he and I did a Faith Angle Forum in Key West, Florida. And so you'd be on Duval Street, and topless, risque T-shirts and topless bars and stuff. Then you go into one of these, right, and talk about it. It was cognitive dissonance, and it was wonderful. Anyway, Gerson and I was chosen to give the response, and it was about George W. Bush's God talk. He was getting a lot of crap in the press from the people like my friend in San Jose who didn't really have the sense of history that they should have. And Gerson and I, we were so similar in our remarks, we didn't even know each other. seemed like a 1-2 punch, but I was supposed to be the rebuttal to him. He gave a couple examples, and one of them was a piece in the New York Times in which, quoting Bush when he was governor, is saying, I asked him to, somebody criticized and reporter said, well, what about that, governor? And Bush said, well, I could say things, but that would be a little bit like, noticing the speck in my neighbor's eye. And
When I have a lock of my own.
And the Times helpfully informed its readers, in parentheses, which apparently is a Texas aphorism for the pot calling the kettle black. So it's from the Sermon on the Mount. It's not exactly like in the footnotes to the Bible. Are there footnotes in the Bible? Okay. And he had a couple examples like that.
We got the Talmud, so it's all
right. And Kirsten says, I submit to you that's not our fault. And when it came my turn to talk, I was a little bit, I wish we'd talk, because my thing was so similar. But I had a group like this. How many? We have 15 here?
15, yeah.
So picture this exact kind of table, but 24 journalists, just slightly larger room. I'm sitting here, or right there, and Gerson's here. Cromartie was in the middle, usually, right?
Right.
And I said, okay, everyone, before I start mine, could you please bow your head in prayer? 24 people. About 8 of them, I'm just guessing because I peeked up, thought, this asshole. About 8 of them thought, oh, thank goodness, a reporter after my own heart, dutifully bowed their heads. And about 8 of them looked confused, except for Andy Ferguson, who knew exactly what I was doing, and I don't know how. And what I was doing was I was reading verbatim Dwight Eisenhower's second inaugural address, in which he started by asking Americans present on the Mall to bow your head in prayer. And then I read the whole speech. It wasn't long. And I only had to substitute a couple of words. And it was Eisenhower. And the point I was making is that presidents had always talked like Bush talked. Roosevelt, in our righteous might, we will smite the enemy. Providence will be our guide. And it was really a point about, not just about religion, but about historic memory. If you're gonna cover journalism, I had more, but I'm gonna wrap up now. We can get to some more. I will leave my friend Will some time, but I'll make one last point. Familiarity doesn't necessarily breed affection. In the last 4 or 5 years, some of the best, most pointed columns have come from people, literally from Mike Gerson and Pete Weiner, who is also a former colleague at Josh's, who've been dismayed about the turn, well, specifically about evangelical support for Donald Trump, specifically, but and all that implies. And some of the best political reporting has been done by John Ward, who you heard this morning, and Tim Alberta, who grew up in evangelical households and are exploring, and they're concerned that the movement has lost its way, that the politics has become. Conservatives like to say that among progressives, politics is their religion, and yet, if you think about some of the things that are going on, there's a story in the Washington Post this morning. I recommend it to you. It's about a county in Michigan. The county council has been taken over by Christian fundamentalists and evangelicals who are not only pro-Trump, but anti. The masking mandate for kids has brought this to a head during the coronavirus. I actually happen to think they were right about the science, but they're not arguing about the science. They're arguing about our values, our Christian values. We want to take back our country from transgender people and gay people and communists and Marxists and the media. And so to understand religion and to have a basis for it is not necessarily to write, kumbaya stories about what's going on. But if you don't have that basis of knowledge, it seems to me we can't get anywhere. I had more, but I'm going to leave it there because this guy is about to take over.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Carl's a wonderful person, and he's got many, many more stories, and you can just get him afterwards, and he'll give you the rest of them.
I have a Falwell story I will tell during the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay.
Does not involve a pool boy, though.
No.
Okay.
No, the Falwell's father.
Oh, it's Falwell Senior.
Yeah.
Some of the things. Well, Carl's sort of given you the history pretty well. I'm gonna talk a little bit from the standpoint of a religious minority and the way I think about these issues. I'm Jewish, and so I recently saw the story. I don't remember the details. The Texas State Senate, I think, was passing some bill about putting the 10 Commandments in schools, and I'm looking at this, and this is giving me flashbacks because back to my childhood. And Josh said we should think back 25 years. I'm going to double that. I'm going to take you back 50 years. Okay, so I'm a kid in Texas, in Southeast Texas, and going to elementary school, public elementary school, and never mind the 10 Commandments. This is a town of about 15,000 people. There are 3 Jewish families. One of them's ours. The other 2 are not even observant, right? So we're the only one that goes to services. Every morning, this is after the Supreme Court ruling on prayer. Every morning over the loudspeaker in my public elementary school, there is a Christian prayer read. It ends with, "In Jesus' name, amen," right? And I'm just like, okay, I'm just like gonna try to get along here and not rock any boats here. I did not raise a stink. My parents did not raise a stink. My experience growing up was like, everybody's Christian. Various kinds of Christian. I was like physically beaten up for being Jewish. People find out you're Jewish, they don't know what that means, but you're just different. Those of you who are religious minorities, you probably have had similar experiences sometimes. Hopefully it's better now than it was then. When I was in 8th grade, there was a kid, a cousin of one of the kids. I'm in a German class. I don't know what I'm expecting, but the kid, he's the cousin. He's across the room, and he says, someone tells him what I am, and he says, "You don't believe Jesus was the Son of God?" And I go, and this kid gets up. He doesn't even go to the school. He gets up out of his desk and he starts walking across the room. And his words were, "I'm going to change your mind." Anyway,
he didn't.
He did not, but he didn't get all the way across the room. I just wanted to like communicate what it was like back then. And I don't know to what extent my hometown has changed entirely. But my experience of religion, of Christianity, was this was a threat to me. These people were a threat, and I was just trying to get along and not get beaten up, right? But then I graduated, and I left Texas, and I went east. I went to Philadelphia. I went to Swarthmore College, which is a Quaker school, right? And, I'm hanging out with liberals, but I'm discovering, one of my friends a lot of Quakers went to Swarthmore, and there was a Quaker meeting house on campus. We want to go to a service. Okay, you go to a service. You go to a Quaker meeting house. This is not like the Pentecostals that I grew up with, right? This is not. Then I have made a friend there who's Mormon. This is after we graduated. Yes, he showed up. He was against the church, but then he went out, became a missionary. One of the people he decided to try to convert was me. He showed up. Would you like, he's got the good news for me or whatever. And we had a nice talk. It wasn't going to happen, but he invited me to go to a service in one of the services in Washington. And I went to a Mormon church. First time I'd been to a service, and it was like the Quakers. It was like they were passing the mic, and I was like, wow, this is not what I thought a Mormon service was going to be, right? I loved it. I thought it was great. And then when after I was out, I had a job. I was editing The Hotline. This Carl will remember way back in the day. And I hired a guy there who was, I knew he was conservative, but I didn't know exactly. He was a Jewish Christian. He had been born Jewish. He had become a Christian. He was a fundamentalist. He was very, very conservative, socially conservative. And he invited me to his church. So I go to, I think it was in Annandale, Emmanuel Bible Church. Is that the name of it? Mm-hmm. Right. So I go there, and it's wild. It's like the other. It's a BYOB, I guess. You just bring your own Bible kind of situation. And it's like rampant Protestantism. It's like everybody's it's all about your personal relationship with Jesus, and everybody's like, it's spontaneous and it's not regimented. And it was I believe after I left though, I think the pastor did run off with the church secretary. That was what I heard. Yeah. So the cliches do happen sometimes. Anyway, so these are 3 very different experiences that I had of Christianity, and I bring it up because it wasn't the experience of my childhood, and it was really important to have those experiences. And what I want to sort of bring us around to talking about is the 2 most important things, which are, in my mind, integration and diversity. Okay, so the integration part comes into play with what Carl was talking about, the great sorting that's happened. You didn't used to know from whether someone went to services what their politics are, and now you do, right? So we have this sorting, and we have this, there's religious people, then there's secular people. I hang out with the secular people. My friends are mostly, almost all liberal, secular, whatever. And this is especially true in journalism. Journalism, very, as Carl said, very secular. I'm doing a big story on Lindsey Graham. One of Lindsey Graham's jokes is, if you look at surveys of the media, 84% are liberal, say they're liberal, the other 16% are lying. That's not literally true, but it's extremely liberal and secular. And so a lot of these secular people that I hang out with, some of them have had bad experiences with religion, like I did, and some of them it's just foreign. It's just they think these people are ignorant, they're backward, they're bigots, they're haters, and they're not entirely wrong. There's lots of bigots and haters out there, but these secular liberals don't have enough experience with religious people who aren't bigots and haters. And it's not that those people don't exist out there, it's just there's just enough integration of the secular and the religious world. So when you're a journalist writing about religion, because I'm interested in the secular audience, part of what I'm interested in is introducing to the secular audience the religious people who do not fit the stereotype that these secular people have in their head. So they need people. What we need are more of these positive models of religion, or just different models. And of course, as Carl was saying, the Trump era has made this worse, right? Because he's sort of brought out the bigots and haters, and he's reinforced the idea that it's all about the bigotry and sectarianism, and above all, the idea of religion as an interest group, which is a very pernicious idea that's taken hold in the Republican Party now. So the challenge is, how do you take these people? How do you go into a profession where so few people have a strong personal connection to religion, where so many people in the profession dislike and distrust religion? And how do you connect that profession to religion, and then so they can connect their audience to it in a constructive way? And here's where I would like to talk a little bit about diversity. So the way diversity has become a code for having representation of certain groups with other groups, right? So if you're an all-white environment, get some people of color in there. If you're an all-male environment, if you're an all-Christian environment, get somebody. And you can end up a little bit sometimes with the Woody Allen joke about he was paid to sit in the window and look Jewish, right? So you can end up with a kind of tokenism. What we need to do, the next phase of this, is get beyond the diversity being checking the box, and we need to talk more about the diversity within groups, okay? Because if you are a white person and you only know 2 people of color for real, you don't really have a representation of the community. You don't really have, and vice versa. And if you're Christian and you don't know, in my town, if there's only 3 Jewish families, you're not really getting a picture of how, you don't see the fights among Jews about Israel or whatever. And so what I want to encourage you to do is 3 things. First of all, to bring to the attention of people religious influences in the values and the causes of the left, right? Because it's been so associated with the right. But there are religious people on the left, and there's a different kind of religion on the left, and illuminating that for people, showing the audience that it's not just the people on the right. Secondly, finding people who are conservative but are people of principle. And Faith Angle has been great for those of us who've gone to it, like people like Russell Moore. When Russell Moore came to Faith Angle in Miami, I gave him such shit over homosexuality, because I was like, how can you, this is not a choice, they're trying to become married, anyway. I did not understand that Russell Moore was like this bastion of sanity against the Trump right. And so I would cover Russell Moore completely differently today if I were writing about him. So showing people who are conservative and religious, who are not corrupt, who have not become part of that. And the third thing is religious diversity among other groups, in particular Muslims, so I'm writing this big article about Lindsey Graham right now, and I go back to 2015. What were Trump and Lindsey Graham fighting about? One of the things was Trump was like, Muslims are evil. Muslims are, we have to keep Muslims out of this country, they're all dangerous. Islam hates America, Islam hates us. I think that's his literal quote. And Lindsey Graham's message is, dude, get out there in the world. If you if you go to Muslims in other countries or Muslims in the United States, you see the people in the faith are the ones that, who are either liberal or pluralist, or they're just trying to stop the extremism and the terrorism. If you would educate yourself, expose yourself to that, you would see that diversity. And so we need more of that too. We need more of illuminating the diversity so people get away from their stereotypes. I'll just leave it there. I want to encourage you to think about integrating the secular world with the religious world in your work, and illuminating diversity not just between groups but within them.
Wonderful. Well, we'll flip to you momentarily. Let's just do one quick apiece. Okay, so Will, for you first. You just spoke, but you mentioned that it's valuable to be writing religious stories that don't fit the stereotype, and I'm wondering why you think that's good and why you think that's fun. And Carl, for you, what is your Jerry Falwell story?
Why it's good?
Yeah, why it's valuable?
It's important to. I think it's just important to. First of all, your job as a journalist is to tell the truth, right? And as you know from part of being a journalist is discovering there is no the truth. There are many. You're just exposing people to the facts, the reality of the world, and the reality of the world is complex. One of the problems of our time is we've sorted into these polar ideologies, where if you go to Fox News or you go to MSNBC, sometimes you're getting this very simplistic view of the world. And part of your job as a journalist is to complicate that by saying, actually, there's a lot more complication, a lot more diversity out there. So you're telling the truth, but you're also breaking down these very dangerous stereotypes, which lead to bigotry, right? Bigotry about Muslims, about liberals, about Jews, about conservatives, and so you're doing a social good. The other thing is, simple views of the world are really boring. They're false, but they're also really boring. So, if one of the mandates of your job as a journalist is to be interesting, you can serve that while you're serving the service of, you're serving truth at the same time, because you're showing people. You have this cliche in your head about what's going on, and I'm going to show you something different that it's going to be interesting to you. So it won't just change you, and won't just inform you. It will entertain you. It will stimulate you to something that's new and interesting. So that's my answer.
I'll get to the Falwell story in one second, but I want to just piggyback on that point, because this idea of cutting against the stereotypes. As journalists, you know this. When you get somebody on the phone that you thought was going to, or in-person interview, you thought was going to dodge you, usually they make a better case for themselves than maybe you thought they would. Maybe you had an idea, whether they're liberal, conservative, or nonpartisan. People tend to be able to express their own beliefs better, certainly better than their opponents characterize their beliefs. We had at the Faith Angle Forum, we had Rick Warren one year, and he was then the most. You had all of these people around the country starting these mega churches, but his success was unlike. It was really extraordinary. He started this church in Orange County, California. He went door to door, and basically he recruited and ended up thousands and thousands of families, but people who didn't go to church at all. He didn't. If people knock on the door, you go to church, he kind of left them alone. He was interested in literally bringing people to the Word. And he had this, and he started this, it's now everywhere, but this modern music, rock and roll, instead of organ hymns. And he had some innovations that, anyway, and he wrote a book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And we were, again, around this table, and Rick, he was asked a question about the book, and as an aside, almost to himself, he said, and around this room, by the way, that book was a runaway bestseller, and also other mega church pastors would buy it in bulk, so they weren't all through Amazon. I don't know if Amazon was that big then, but around this table were David Brooks and Andy Ferguson and Malcolm Gladwell, people who had written bestsellers, really successful authors, and people like me, who I write least sellers. But half the people there had written books, and Rick Warren sort of muttered to himself, he said, I sold 18 million copies of A Purpose-Driven Life before I got my first review in an American newspaper. 18 million. If you sell 35,000 copies, you're on the New York Times bestseller list. This was, and Malcolm Gladwell was there. This was everybody's book put together. He'd sold more before he got his first review in an American newspaper. And Elsa Walsh, who's Bob Woodward's wife, was sitting next to me, and she leans over to me, she says, "Gee, that is all you need to know about media bias." Here's a book that every evangelical in the country's heard of and most of them own, and no book editor in an American newspaper even heard of it. But anyway, Rick Warren got in trouble there that day. People liked him, but the question came up, Jewish woman from Philadelphia, let's just see, this guy's pretty charismatic, but let's see if he's as dumb as I think he is. Do Jews go to hell? Well, for that moment, Rick Warren was as dumb as she thought he was. She thought he was, because he said, well, I don't say that. It's the book of John. It was kind of an appalling answer, because this guy, he was not an unsophisticated person. And this is a guy, he was on his computer one night. He has these satellite churches all around the world, all around California, but all around the world. And one night, 2 a.m, he's up on his computer, and somebody's from the Pacific, from Indonesia or somewhere, Sri Lanka, sends him an email. We just had an earthquake. It's a bad one. That means we're getting a tsunami. This was the great tsunami that wiped out and killed 200,000 people. Rick Warren, Saddleback Church sends more people to abroad than one church than the Peace Corps does every year. Now they're there for 1 week, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. They're not there 2 years, but still. He sent out a message, these people are going to need help. There were blankets and foodstuffs and help on the way from these people in Rick Warren's network before the U.S. Navy, before the White House knew about it. So this was but this one question, he flubs what you think would be a very easy question. The next day we were on a bike ride. Did you ever go on those bike rides? And were you, no? In Key West?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm not the group.
Okay. So we get up at 6 a.m, go for a bike ride before the session starts. And Peb Jackson, who was, he's gone now, but you remember him, Paul, Peb. He rides up to me on the bike, and he says, how did you think Rick did? I said, well, except getting an F on the easiest part of the test. He said, well, what should he have said? It was a trap question. And by the way, when he asked this question, it got heated for a moment. You could call it up on the transcript. The transcript doesn't do it justice, because in those days, before Josh's enlightened leadership, we kind of sanitized the transcript. But these people got mad at Rick, and there was back and forth. And finally, Jeffrey Goldberg, who was then with the New Yorker, he was one of the moderators, and he said, well, I feel the need to defend my Jewish sisters here, because there were 3 women who kind of jumped on Rick for that answer. And he said, I think it's a matter of historic fact that Jesus of Nazareth was born a Jew, preached as a Jew, and died as a Jew. And even the evangelicals in the room got quiet. Okay, it was a nice way to end the discussion, because it was true and it couldn't be denied. But anyway, so Peb asked me, what about this? I said, well, he said, well, what should Rick have said? I said, he should have said what Billy Graham told George W. Bush to say when George W. Bush made the same stupid comment. And he said, I don't know the story. I said, well, okay. Governor Bush was going to Israel for a junket that governors go on, and on the way out, Ken Herman, a wonderful reporter for the Austin American Statesman, Jewish, and a very funny and clever person, said, what are you going to tell the Israelis? And Bush just waves, and it's like the chopper is going or whatever. He said, you going to tell them they're all going to hell? And Bush laughed, and yeah, and got on the plane. So Ken writes a straight story, but he tells his editors about this conversation. He said, you got to put that in your piece. Ken Herman said, it's kind of a cheap shot. I'm the one who said it. He said, but he agreed with you. So they wrote a story. Next morning, governor's mansion, the phone rings. It's Barbara Bush. Georgie, did you tell Ken Herman that all Jews are going to hell? And I don't know, you've seen Barbara Bush, maybe. She's a little before your time, but she was a formidable character. And Bush goes, well, Mom, it was really a cheap shot. And Ken called me privately and apologized. And he tells her story. She says, no, even so, you'll be getting a call from Billy. And Bush told me a story later. He said, did I have a cousin named Billy I didn't know about? He couldn't figure. Well, it's Billy Graham. He calls Bush and he says, in that great stentorian voice, Piedmont, sound like Shakespeare, if Shakespeare was a North Carolinian. Did you tell the world, George, that God's chosen people are all going to hell? And he said, oh, man. So he repeats it. Well, he repeats the stupid excuse about Ken Herman. George says, well, Billy Graham says, George, it's not up to the governor of Texas who goes to heaven and hell. Bush says, yeah, but the guy sandbagged me the question. And he repeats himself, George, it's not up to the governor of Texas who goes to heaven and hell. And Bush interrupts him again and gives him an excuse. Graham repeats it for the third time, and then Bush realizes Graham is telling him what he should have said to Ken Herman and anybody else, and what Rick Warren should have said this. It's not up to pastor of Saddleback Church who goes to heaven and hell. So I said this to Pep Jackson. He said, oh, what are you doing for the next 3 years? I said, what do you mean? He says, we need a communications director so badly. Well, obviously, that wasn't my calling, and I would have failed miserably at that job. But you asked about Falwell.
Well, yes, that's right.
Real quick. Yeah. Falwell story short. That's long. Jerry Falwell at the 2000 convention, the old man. And I was thinking of Rick Warren and Falwell because I was thinking, this Michigan story, what would they think of these people in Michigan who take over the county council because they think Christ wants them to ban whatever? Anyway, so Falwell had some contracept said, if you've ever covered a political convention, how many of you covered a political convention? Oh my God, yeah. Oh, you've got to do it. It's for 4 days, the Star Wars scene, the bar scene in Star Wars, 4 days. Anyway, and this was one of those events, and Falwell had gotten some minor scrape, and the cameras are all, it's like Hollywood packed around him, some scrum. Well, I had written, and I worked for National Journal then. We put out a daily newspaper at the convention and hand-delivered it at great expense to every delegate's door and every reporter's door in their hotels. And I had this little story about Falwell, what he was up to. And it must have started some minor thing because Falwell was besieged by cameras. So I went up to see, if he was going to wiggle out of it or something. And I couldn't even get close enough to hear what he was saying. But in my story, you write these stories and it's, Falwell or the televangelist or the bad, you're always looking for another word, the president. So you just have to say Biden's name every sentence. But something came over me and I had written the portly pastor. And I assumed somebody on the desk would take it out, but they didn't. They liked it. And so this went into the thing. And in the story that had caused this small rumpus, I had called Falwell the portly pastor. So anyway, the scrum disappears. And Falwell looks at my name tag. I didn't even know him. And he goes, you work for National Journal, don't you? I said, yes, sir. He says, you called me fat. And he's a big guy. He played linebacker in college, huge hands. And he was like menacing. His face was sort of contorted in anger. I said, I know. And I really owe you an apology. I shouldn't have done that. He goes, well, let me ask you a question. And he kind of gets right in my face. Let me ask you a question. I said, yes, sir. He goes, is truth still a defense to libel? And I said, yeah. He goes, and he pats his belly. He says, then you have nothing to worry about.
That's funny. Nice.
So we get close to these people. We tend to like them a little more, I think. All right.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Over to you. Who's up? Post-lunch stories. There's a lot more of them. I know these guys. Yes, sir. Sam Benson from Deseret News.
Yeah, question for you, Will. You talked about combating kind of overly simplistic views and simplistic truths with more complexity and nuance in our reporting. I'm interested in your perspective on the present state of media with technology and an emphasis on quick, kind of bite-sized news bits and scoops, and everything moves so quickly. How can we make sure that we're doing our due diligence and adding nuance and complexity to everything we report?
It's a challenge, but the weird thing is, I actually love the era of social. I don't love the conformity of the era of social media, but I love short form and Twitter. Until recently, it's been sort of corrupted by the new owner. But the idea, a lot of information can be conveyed, and a lot of diverse information can be conveyed in short form. Then that's actually digestible for an audience that won't do the long form. I mean, ideally, what we would have is both. So I see people who write a story. It's a long story. That's like 1,000 words, 2,000 words, something. And they know that there's an audience of people who will read that. But there can be some difficulty with, first of all, people who won't take the time to read a long story. And also there's the gate, there's paywalls and stuff like that. and they'll tweet parts of the story, and I'll sometimes start going with somebody's thread, and I'll find myself having read 1,000 words without realizing it. So I think part of the challenge of our time is how can you want to be supported to write the in-depth story, to go far enough in to find the complexity of the story. But then you also can find ways to publish that in multiple formats so that, first of all, you're broadening your audience because there's a lot of diversity of readers in terms of what they will read, long-form readers, short-form readers. Also, you can find ways to, and this will be a challenge, to diversify the monetization of it so you can support this kind of journalism. So I think the future might be in that kind of combination of audiences, finding ways to reach multiple audiences with the same. But in terms of the speed with which you have to write, that's an inherent challenge. And I would just say, as from my point of view, I have tried sometimes to appease editors by writing some quicker things while I'm working on a longer thing. I mean, this Lindsey Graham thing has taken me like a year. And while I was doing it, I was doing podcasts, doing shorter stuff. So you're trying to feed the beast of your editor and the audience while at the same time working on the thing you love. And you can find ways maybe to make that model work.
Catherine Post with Religion News Service.
Yeah, this question actually follows right along with Samuel's question. So I work for the Religion News Service, and positive stories about religion are kind of our bread and butter. It's what we love to do, but they don't get as many clicks as the scandalous stories. The top stories on our website are always something terrible happening in evangelicalism, or some kind of sexual abuse scandal. So how do we get around that? Like, do you have any suggestions for how do we get more readers to want to click on the positive examples of religion and spirituality, or the stories that we work really hard on to be about religious diversity? Like, how do we get our readers to want to read those stories?
I'll say one comment about that. This is not a new problem.
Right.
It's I worked for Night Reader newspapers back in the Pleistocene era, and we did this very expensive and extensive survey of our readers, asked them what they wanted. And what they wanted was coverage of the school board, in-depth stories about politics, giving both sides, explanations of what works in law enforcement and what doesn't, what works in the criminal justice system. This is what they said they wanted. Then we started tracking what they were reading. They were reading features about should you wear spandex to the mall, and so I just think there's this balance in journalism that's inherent. That like Clarence Darrow was the greatest defense lawyer this country's ever produced, and he would do these great cases for free, the famous cases you've heard of Sacco and Vanzetti and those cases. But then he would do some cases for the railroad industry to make money so he can support himself. I think we have to have that balance. In the click era, it's a problem because we know in real time. But I think we have to do both kind of stories, one to keep the lights on and the other one to keep the Americans' lights on up here. And I just think we have to acknowledge that not every story we do is going to get the clicks the other one does, but we still have to do them because we want to do them.
It's okay to put bacon in your salad. I mean, just like when you're serving, it's okay to give people the scandals, and what you're hoping is that you
don't keep kosher.
No, not at all. Sorry, sorry, bad metaphor. No, just confess. But part of what you're doing, and there's a move back in media these days to trying to recover the idea of a homepage and an audience, and you're not fractured among social media. So part of, if you can develop an identity, like here we're Religion News Service, this is what we do, and we want you to, we're going to give you those scandal stories, partly because they're important and partly because we know that that'll bring you in here. But we're going to try to keep you here. We're going to try to bring you in. And while we're here, by the way, we have this other interesting thing. And the other interesting thing is not the porn. It's not some bad thing. It's not evil or just prurient or whatever. But it might be just surprising to you. So there are lots of ways that you can make diverse. Certainly, if what you're showing people is complexity they didn't expect, that is inherently a surprise. And so, surprise sells, not as well as evil, but it does sell.
Great. Let's do one more, and then we'll take a brief break and start anew. Okay, so Corinne Hajar from Wall Street Journal.
So we've talked a lot about the simplicity in covering organized religion and sometimes the lack of nuance there, but I think that there's also been simplicity covering and understanding the other side of that, which is a growing spirituality movement, whatever that means. No, I don't think anyone really knows what more young Americans identifying as spiritual means. So I know it's a big question, but I'm wondering if you have an answer to figuring that out and finding the nuance in that.
Go first.
No.
Oh, I have one thought about that, which is that that's a very good observation. What we've tended to think, people who've chronicled the rise of the nuns, especially among young people, what we've tended to think is that some of them will say that they're spiritual but not religious. They'll make this distinction, and we tend to think, oh, they're just saying that. They're really on their way to being atheists. But that's probably not true. It's an assumption that religious leaders make, and I mean small c conservatives make. I mean people who are looking at this data and kind of seeing the most obvious thing in it. But this idea that it's hard to cover, it's not a movement, and it's very individual, and it's hard to cover people, who aren't articulate about their own deal. It reminds me, what's the most obvious bias in the news business in a news story? It's for the good quote. It's for a person who expresses himself in a pithy way. But these other people who don't, or don't have, they don't check a box, or they're not easy to categorize, it takes a lot of work. But I'm inferring from what you're saying that we'd find some very interesting stories from these people and interesting trends. And I think we ought to do it, pursue it.
I think there's a great opportunity for bridge building and also illumination between the spiritual and the religious. That people who, I did a story about GMOs one time, and I was like, I really got into anti-GMO world, and I was like, oh my God, this is totally a religion, and there are lots of our friends who are like, they think they're secular, but they have some, dietary cult or whatever that's like, they've built up all the stuff around it, or they have, a yoga practice or something like. These are very deep-seated human yearnings. These are, and there's a lot of secular people who have a conceit that like the religious people are backward or whatever. But if you start to look at the secular people, and their ideology of Whole Foods or whatever it is, like they have their own religious instincts that they're denying. I mean, I think religion is like sex, right? So like the right is like constantly trying to suppress sex and pretending it's not, and then the left is like kind of suppressing religion. But the religious impulse is kind of like the sexual impulse. It's like everybody's got it, it's there, it comes out one way or another, and the question is how. And part of what you can do as a journalist is to illuminate the various kinds of it, including the spiritual, ostensibly non-religious, but spiritual.
Well, Will Saltan and Carl Cannon, thank you so much. That was awesome.